Hello, everybody. I'm Scott Jaschik with Inside Higher Ed, and welcome to MLA's Got Talent 2019. Simon Crowell couldn't be here. He is delayed at a session on text and subtext. So we have other distinguished judges, and we have great panelists who will talk today. And they are going to do something very difficult. They are going to present an important idea that reflects their scholarship. They're going to try and do it in a way that will be understandable to non-experts. And they're going to speak without notes. As MC, I get to bring up notes, but none of them will have notes. And the time limit, there's a timer here, but it's not a, they don't have any notes on the screen here, will be strictly enforced and buzzed. So this is a hard thing. So the question is, why did MLA do this? Why did MLA recruit these people to talk in this way? And I think it's a really important project, and I commend the MLA for doing it and these individuals for participating. So as a journalist who covers higher education, I regularly deal with MLA members and other scholars. I rarely am not impressed with the intellect and passion of MLA members, but many times I am unimpressed with their ability to explain what they're doing to a non-expert. I think that's a real challenge for many. And I'll give you an example. Some years ago, I was working on an article, and I called a professor, and I asked him, I said, what is your area of expertise? And he said he was a scholar of Goethe. And he said, have you heard of him? And I said, yes, I have heard of him. And then he said, have you read him in the original? And when I said no, he said, oh, in a way that conveyed that to him, the world was divided into two groups. Those who had read Goethe in the original and simpletons. And I was in the latter category. And so why does this matter? In part it matters because there are lots of people like me who do want to understand what's going on. But it also matters fundamentally, in my opinion, because I think that the work that you do, the work of the humanities, matters and has never been more important. I went to the session, the Humanities in 5 yesterday, where we had 7 senior scholars talk, and every one of their talks was fascinating. But what's really interesting, as I was thinking about it later, is that every one of their talks was, pardon the expression, relevant. Think how frequently the humanities are dismissed as light and irrelevant. Every talk there was relevant to things going on in the world today. And as I look at the world today, I think we need more people to understand what you do. Think about the use of a phrase like America first. And then think about the fact that most people who hear that phrase may not have ever read Politics and the English Language, or read the novel The Plot Against America, and then think about how if they had read that essay or that novel, they might have a different understanding. Think about how much of our political discourse is about a topic that is discussed frequently at MLA, the other, and denigrating the other. And imagine what our discourse might be like if people understood what that meant. Think about the society that we're in where knowledge of foreign languages and cultures is denigrated, and then look at the world we're in. And so I'm left thinking that it would be a better place if more of you weren't just brilliant, you know, I'll accept that you're brilliant, but if you were brilliant and could explain it. And that is what I think the MLA is encouraging with this contest, and these brave individuals are going to participate in a minute. Now, we also have, there are going to be 2 votes. One is going to be a vote by you on the top 3, and you will be, and here's the Wi-Fi if you want to get logged in now, And you might want to even jot down notes as the people speak. The candidates will be speaking in alphabetical order, so that you can vote for the top 3, in your opinion, at the end. But we're also joined by 3 distinguished judges who are not academics full-time. They are actually, so this is my bias, they're journalists, which I think is inherently a good thing. And so we have Donna Seaman from Booklist, Carmen Carrillo from the Chicago Tribune, and Jim DeRogatis, who's the co-host of Sound Opinions. And they are seated here, no bribery please, even though we are in Chicago. And they will be, after each talk, they may offer a quick comment. One of them will offer a quick comment. Then when we're done, they will exit the room and caucus and return with their decision while you all will vote. Now the criteria are making material accessible for a general audience, avoiding jargon. Think about that, avoiding jargon. That could be a good goal even in your classrooms. Engaging the audience and judges, conveying a clear takeaway idea or point, and capturing the interest and importance of the scholarship. So that's what they're going to be looking for. And we'll tell you how to vote at the end. And now we're going to start. And again, the people will come up here, they will stand here, no notes, only the clock telling them how much time they have left. And they will be told they must sit down if the buzzer goes off. So we're going to start with Manu Chander, who is associate professor at Rutgers University, Newark, and he's going to talk about world literature and world legislation.
Let's face it, nobody loves poets more than poets love poets. And the English Romantic poets loved poets. William Wordsworth wrote that, a poet, he's basically just the same thing as you and me. He's a man speaking up to other men, but he just happens to have a greater knowledge of human nature, a more comprehensive soul than are common among mankind. This kind of sentiment was echoed by other romantics, such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats. Of all these self-aggrandizing, maybe pompous comments about the importance of the poet, one in particular has always struck me as rather useful. At the end of his defense of poetry, Percy Shelley writes, "Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world." My research focuses on the truly unacknowledged, underrepresented poets of the world, romantics writing throughout the British colonies in the 19th century. Figures like Henry Derozio, the Calcutta-born mixed-race East Indian who fancied himself the savior of India. As a poet, he was capable of diving back into history and recovering a kernel of its former glory and bringing it back to the present for all to share. Figures like Egbert Martin, the Afro-Guyanese poet who conceived of his role as that of a magician, someone who weaves a song divine, a kind of alchemist, one who turns the baser materials of the world into gold. Martin himself was bedridden for most of his very short life. Every morning, someone would come and pick up his poems. He wrote over 300 poems, hand-deliver them to the local newspapers to publish. After his death, one of those newspapers, the Argosy, published a notice from his mother begging those who appreciated his works to contribute to establish a little tombstone to mark his grave. That tombstone does not exist. My point here is that for certain figures, to be a poet is not just to gain recognition for oneself, to blow up one's ego. It's also to call attention to the community that you represent. These were figures, I call them brown romantics, that were working to represent their nation, to serve as a national poet before their countries had the status of a nation. These were still colonies. For them, to be a poet meant more than to be a god among men. It meant to be the promise of a community. And this is not just a matter of historical record. Even today, with the novel and film and television eclipsing poetry in popularity, even today, there are those striving, unacknowledged legislators working to give voice and form to their communities. I think of Talib Kweli and Styles P, fixtures of the New York underground hip-hop scene, who in 2017, against the backdrop of the violence and injustice that gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement, penned a track called Poets and Gangstas. It's not a humble song. They aspire to be the conscience of the nation on hard beats. They tell us that their streets are darker than the color of charred beef. They tell us that the flesh is dark and falling off like the flesh of a zombie. They tell us justice. They dangle it in front of us like some car keys, snatch it back and peel out like a car thief. They tell us these streets need a mouthpiece. These streets need a mouthpiece. For all the accusations of bravado and machismo that hip-hop poets are charged with, they nevertheless mobilize, in cases like Talib and Styles, that position towards politically urgent ends. Thank you.
And now a comment from one of our judges.
As a Latinx poet, you should take this one.
I'm a recovering poet. Thank you for going first. That couldn't have been easy. I really appreciate the brown poet perspective. My grandparents are from Mexico, so I can relate. Yeah, it was good.
And he's a pretty good rapper.
He is a pretty good rapper.
I think it was a very relaxed and well-paced presentation, and you told a story, so you really drew us in, and there was some emotion to it and some real significance. I love how you took the Shelley quote and turned it into something connected to hip-hop. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Ryan Cordell, who is Associate Professor of English at Northeastern University, and he will talk about a prehistory of fake news in 19th century newspapers.
So fake news is not new, and it's driven, at least in part, by our desire for tidy narratives that explain the world. Understanding the history of fake news can give us resources for identifying and subverting the form, in fact, in online media. So fake news is everywhere in 19th century newspapers, which I study as part of the Viral Text Project at Northeastern University. I work with a computer scientist, and we've developed algorithms for identifying the most frequently reprinted text in 19th century newspapers. At the time, in the 19th century, editors belonged to a kind of social network. It was called the exchanges system, and they mailed their newspapers to each other, and when they found things they thought their readers would like, they would cut it out and they would reprint it in their paper. This material wasn't protected by intellectual property. This is how newspapers operated during the period. And when we look at the most frequently reprinted text, what emerges is the dominance of a particular genre which we've been calling the vignette. These are these very short prose pieces that borrow a little bit from journalism. So we have a young gentleman visiting Germantown. We have this kind of geographic specificity. But then as we read this story, we have this young man who sees a young woman that he wants to woo in church. He underlines passages in his Bible, passes it to her, and we learn that from the above interview, the marriage took place the ensuing week. It's an ending right out of a piece of sentimental fiction. So we have the journalistic married with the literary. Another example, we have during the month of January 1850, there's two gentlemen from New York who were overheard speaking at the Sutter House, Sacramento. Again, specific time, specific place, but the ensuing scene is a kind of humorous scene right out of a piece of regional fiction that ends in a joke rooted in a misunderstanding of dialect. So again, the literary paired with the journalistic. It's not always funny. Sometimes we get a moral. Here we have two farmers who have a problem with their crops. One farmer is industrious and sort of solves the problem, and at the end we learn it is astonishing how many misfortunes might be repaired by a little alacrity and energy. So these vignettes for me are a kind of encapsulation of the 19th century newspaper itself, where on the same page you have news and opinion and fiction and poetry and every genre kind of all jostled together with very little formal differentiation between the different genres. And I want to argue further that that's very much like browsing a social media feed today, where you will encounter a news story, someone's opinion, a bit of pop culture, and everything in between with very little differentiation between all of the different genres. And if we begin to look in social media, we will find that the vignette is everywhere. So I started, I will confess, with my aunt's social media feed. She posts an awful lot of vignettes that are often in the form of videos. And these are these kind of just so stories that begin with maybe some specific details, a small hotel in Philadelphia, USA, and then end in a kind of political or sort of uplifting kind of moral. And this is paired on her feed with an awful lot of other kinds of fake news. We could also look at something like this that went viral a few years ago, a mother wearing a niqab who is upbraided by a racist for not speaking English. When you're in the UK, you should really be speaking English, at which point this other woman upbraids the man, saying she's in Wales and she's speaking Welsh. Perfect. It's a perfect vignette in the form, and it went wildly viral. This was a few days, in fact, before the Brexit vote in the UK. It was reported in the newspaper. It was even printed in the Times of London in a way that really recalls the 19th century vignette. But then people began to realize that, like those 19th century vignettes, the precise details were a bit fuzzy, and they started to realize that this probably didn't actually happen. And then they actually found that exact vignette that had gone viral before, except set in the American Southwest, where the languages were Spanish and Navajo. So it's this perfect vignette form. In many ways, these kinds of things maybe feel a little bit more innocuous than what we think about with fake news, but my argument is that this form and the way that it floods the media really prepares people to accept other kinds of tidy narratives about political figures and such. And that by understanding this form, we can be a little bit more critically aware when we encounter these stories. And I see some signs of hope. One of my favorite vignettes, this is a perfect vignette that's about Britney Spears at Kohl's, who sees a young man whose mother gets on to him, and she says, "You will grow up and accomplish great things." And we learn that the little boy grew up to be Steve Jobs, right? This writer understands the vignette perfectly and is able to subvert the form. And that gives me a lot of cause for hope. All right.
Thank you. Comment from a judge.
I empathize with you there, Professor. The number of times my smart classroom has made me feel dumb waiting for slides. Jill Lepore's new one-volume history of the United States of America has a nice couple of paragraphs on fake news, and everything you just said further illuminated that very well.
Thank you.
I would just add that I love the connection to the past. We're always sort of panicking. It's never happened before. It's never been this way. So it's so important to look back and see that human nature is the same. Our tools change. Thank you.
So our next speaker is, I'm sorry, did you want to? Our next speaker is Liam Corley. He is a professor of American literature at California State University Polytechnic at Pomona. And his talk will be on the voice of the veteran in American literature.
January 5th, 2009, 10 years ago today, I began my 71st day of a 10-month military deployment to Afghanistan. You see, in addition to being a literature professor, I am also an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve. My call sign is Cassandra. A nod to the Trojan woman cursed by Apollo with the ability to see the future, but never be believed. When I returned to the university world after almost a year in a combat zone, I was struck by two things. First, there are a heck of a lot of veteran characters in American short stories, novels, and poems. I had been teaching some works for almost a decade, and I'd never taken note of the many characters with military backstories. Now, the reason for all of these veterans in American literature that you're going to see scrolling on this screen to my left isn't hard to understand. Because the United States was born out of a war with Great Britain, its national identity is more tied to military conflict than countries with shared languages, geographic boundaries, or traditions. As a result, veteran characters give American writers a special perspective to critique the nation's identity and purpose. So the second thing I was struck by when I returned from my deployment is that when people would ask me for an opinion about our wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, I found myself tongue-tied. Even though veterans are afforded a lot of respect in America, I felt like my words had to match a model people had in their minds of what a veteran knew. Things like stress under fire, loyalty to comrades, or especially bitterness towards people in charge who didn't know what was really going on. What I wanted to share didn't match those expectations, and that made me keep silent. It took a while, but eventually I came to see that those two situations, the history of veteran depictions in literature on the one hand and my difficulty in speaking my mind on the other, were related. In many ways, my call sign, Cassandra, the Trojan woman who could see the future but never be believed, suggests how veteran characters are deployed by American writers, and how that deployment affects what real-life veterans feel capable of saying. Though some Americans are cursed by the experience of war with insight into foreign affairs and into war itself, they are depicted as having less and less ability to make use of that knowledge for themselves or their communities as the 19th century unfolded. In the book I'm working on, The Voice of the Veteran in American Literature, I trace how veteran characters in the late 18th century began as representative Americans who gained experiential knowledge that could be shared with others through public leadership. Citizen soldiers like General Washington learned from their time at war, but they were not defined by it. By the end of the century, though, veteran identity in literature had more to do with depoliticized individual experiences like trauma, loyalty to friends, or physical suffering. Veteran characters were depicted as pathetic figures who couldn't control their own fates and were so impacted by their war experiences that they only had insight into issues like mortality, guilt, or shame. For a community of voters, this narrowing of war's meaning into its effects on individuals is destructive. If the public looks to veterans for some insights into war, and veterans are only expected to understand things like trauma, friendship, disillusionment, then the country's conversations about the strategies and effects of specific wars will be inadequate. By exploring the history of veteran depictions in literature and showing how those depictions have resulted in a depoliticized individual perspective on war, I hope to change that and to help the Cassandra voices of all veterans to be heard. Thank you.
That was really a fresh perspective to point out stereotypes, to point out a reduction of understanding about the veteran experience, and that you bring both military experience and literary expertise to this is really unusual and invaluable. And I thought your presentation was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Erin Cowling, who is an assistant professor of Spanish in the Humanities department at MacEwan University in Edmonton, Alberta. Her talk will be on From Cup to Commerce, How Chocolate Made the Transatlantic Journey into Spain's Literature.
So you've probably all heard of chocolate before, yes? Maybe you've even heard something like chocolate will give you that little bit of extra energy to get through the end of the day, right? Or maybe your best friend just broke up with their partner and they're feeling down and all they want to do is drown their sorrows in a tub of chocolate ice cream, you know? Or even that chocolate can be better than sex, right? So what I'm here today to talk about is how those ideas came into the Western European consciousness approximately 100 years after Cortez sat down with Montezuma in 1519 and tried the first, for Spaniards, cup of chocolate. So within those first 100 years, chocolate started to gain popularity pretty quickly in the Spanish Empire, and particularly in Spain. It also started to gain some enemies. The first enemy was the church. The church was pretty concerned about chocolate for two different reasons. The first was that chocolate was starting to infiltrate Mass. Okay. This was a big problem because people would not only bring chocolate with them to Mass, they would ask their servants to go out and get them more chocolate in the middle of Mass and interrupt the priest while he was very diligently giving his sermon. So that was a big problem. But we see here actually the Eucharist and the vessel for making chocolate in this still life from Antonio de Pereda in the middle of the 17th century. So it was a known combination. The other problem the church had with it was the idea of fasting. Fasting was still very important at this point in the Catholic Church, and they were worried that chocolate would give people too much energy to get through a fasting day. And yet, in the 1680s, when the first American saint was going to be beatified, which was a woman named Rosa from Lima, Peru, a play was written in her honor that talked about her diligence to God. She was always fasting, but she would also drink chocolate as a medicine to quell the stomach pains that she was getting from fasting. And so there's that interesting feeling in Spain that it's not a good thing to have in the church, and yet in the New World, they were inviting chocolate into the church. So this is actually from the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City. It is a chapel that has a Christ of the cacao bean. And that was so that the indigenous converts could continue their tradition of using the cacao bean as a monetary device and an offering to their gods. The other big proponent against chocolate, or the big debate against chocolate in Spain at the time, was by medical practitioners. They were worried that people were overindulging because they're having it 3, 4, 5 times a day, and that the Spanish makeup, the humors of the Spanish body, the things that they thought made up our body, were not accustomed to something like chocolate. And so when they hear these different stories about how chocolate can actually cure you, including an anonymous great sermon written that said Spain was going to replace religion with chocolate and go out to Africa and Asia and spread the word of chocolate instead of the word of God. So both, and the reason they were going to spread the word of chocolate is because it could cure all your ills. So both the church and the medical practitioners had some problems with this. And so instead of fighting against it, there started to be rumors that chocolate was actually really bad for you, that it could poison you. And within the Great Sermon as well, the pharmacists who are tasked with creating this medicine out of chocolate in Asia and in Africa say, I want your name, guy who's giving me this recipe, because if the king dies, I don't want to be the one in trouble. I want you to be the one in trouble. So this sort of rumor, myth that chocolate could actually kill you started to be promulgated in the later half of the 17th century. Which brings us towards the end of the 17th century and a darker side of chocolate. That chocolate could potentially harm you, that it could potentially kill you. And this guy here is the last Habsburg king of Spain, Carlos II, who is also known as Carlos the Cursed. And he was known by the cursed because it was said that his own mother took advantage of his gluttonous nature. He was known to love chocolate to the point where they told him, stop spending so much money on chocolate. You're bankrupting the kingdom. So she apparently used chocolate to poison him. And that is the first attempt of death by chocolate. Thank you.
I would like to belong to the Church of Chocolate, please. You incorporated history into one of my favorite subjects very well, so thank you. Anybody else?
Can we have a snack? I thought there'd be snacks.
Our next speaker will be Vanessa DiMaggio. She is currently in the 6th year of her PhD program in Italian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and her talk will be on how Dante got his news.
So today I'm going to talk to you about Dante Alighieri, who you may know as the star of a Dan Brown novel, also a Tom Hanks movie. But really, Dante was an Italian poet who lived about 700 years ago. And I'm hoping that this talk will convince you that he was also a proto-journalist, an author who paid attention to and wrote about the most interesting or important events of his time. Now, this was due in large part to Dante's culture. Medieval Italy had a unique public of urban populations who were eager for information. The word gazette is actually Italian in origin. A gazzetta was a Venetian coin, and that's how much news sheets sold for when they first appeared in the 17th century. Now, if you've heard of any of Dante's works at all, it's probably the Inferno, right? Most people here have heard of Dante's Inferno. But the Inferno is actually just the first part of Dante's 3-part masterpiece, the Divine Comedy. And in the comedy, Dante, who's also the protagonist of his work, travels through the 3 realms of the afterlife: hell, purgatory, and heaven. Now, Dante's lost, he's having a midlife crisis, and this journey teaches him what it means to lead a good life. And Dante meets a lot of other souls along the way, themselves who act as examples of good, evil, and the giant gray area in between. But what I find fascinating is how many of these souls were historical people, real people who lived and died. If you take a look at the numbers here, there are 332 total characters in the Divine Comedy. About half of them were active just before or during Dante's lifetime. And if you break that down even further, about 1/3 of them were alive at the same time as Dante. Now, you might think that Dante just knew those people personally, or he was friends with them. And that's true for some of them. But most of them, Dante had never met. So how did he know who they were, or how they died? He knew them because they were involved in newsworthy or sensational events. And I have a map here that shows you where just a few of those events were happening. And if we quickly canvass the scene, we can see that we have assassinations, forgeries, freak accidents, a woman thrown out of a window, the kinds of things that got people talking. But this is the Middle Ages. There weren't newspapers yet. News sheets wouldn't show up in Florence for another 350 years. So how did news travel back then? Well, if enough time had passed, you could read about a newsworthy event in a chronicle. Chronicles compiled major events, usually in yearly entries, kind of like a diary for society. But they tended to be highly localized and pretty biased. So the example I have for you here depicts a battle between Siena and Florence. And depending on which of the 2 towns the writer of the chronicle comes from, that battle comes across very differently. Think about how Fox News and MSNBC will present the same topic from 2 very different perspectives. Other ways news traveled included letters, either through the merchant or diplomatic networks. Poems and songs that covered current events would be read or sung aloud in the piazza. And then you might pass a government building like this one and see these murals painted on its outside walls. These were called pitture infamanti, and they were portraits either of men who were still wanted for crimes, like a most wanted poster, or who the commune just wanted to shame as publicly as possible. And then, of course, there was gossip, right? An eyewitness to an event might show up in Florence, start telling everyone what he saw, and it would get passed along until it became commonplace information. And this is why Dante frequently says things in the comedy like, if you're from Florence, you know who he is, or if you're a Tuscan, you've heard about this. Now, I'm hoping that you guys are starting to see the problem with studying these ways in which Dante got his news. They've all disappeared. Either they disappeared the moment they existed, like gossip, or they were thrown away or erased as soon as they were no longer relevant. So sometimes Dante's poem is actually our only surviving account of record for an event or a person's life. Now, Dante did differ from a journalist in one very big way. He wasn't reporting current events, he was recording them. So in a way, you might say he was writing old news. But that's because he was writing to readers of the future, leaving them lessons whose relevance lasted long after the events themselves. We, as Dante's readers, are supposed to use these real people's stories to understand good versus evil and the role that we play in the society that we make. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've never seen a breakdown of the people in the Divine Comedy before like that. It was really fascinating. And to be reminded of the ephemeral and how we have to really search for traces. So thank you very much.
It's brilliant. As an Italian whose uncle's name is Dante because my grandfather worshipped the poet. I just love how much he pissed off the church all the time by telling that news.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Sean Gerrity. He is Assistant Professor of English at Ostos Community College of the City University of New York. He will be talking about Beyond the Underground Railroad, Stories of the American Maroons.
So when most of us think about slavery, American slavery, two images come to mind. One is of dozens or hundreds of enslaved laborers picking cotton on a massive plantation in the Deep South. The other is of the lone fugitive striking out for freedom by fleeing to the north, usually along the Underground Railroad, right, to the northern states or Canada. And these stories reproduce a kind of hyper-sectionalized geography that locates freedom in the north and slavery and unfreedom exclusively in the south. What these images and these stories leave out is the American Maroons. And Maroons were enslaved people who took flight from bondage and wound up, and established lives for themselves in remote, often inhospitable places like swamps, forests, mountains, still crucially within slaveholding states, within the slaveholding South. The word maroon derives from the Spanish cimarron, which was used by the Spanish in their colonies to refer to cattle who had escaped from their pastures and wound up in the mountains. So it's literally, from the enslaver's perspective, a reference to people or things not where they're supposed to be, out of place. Thinking about maroonage, it's useful to think about maroonage as a kind of umbrella term and practices that Maroons engaged in as an umbrella term. A Maroon might be an enslaved person who ran away for 3 days after a particularly brutal beating and took solace in the swamp. A Maroon also might be someone, and we have historical examples of this, who lived and died in the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina. Born there, died there, never experienced what we conventionally think of as slavery in this country. And what's important about Maroons is that when we consider them, historically, in order to be a Maroon, one needed to remain concealed, hidden, right? Living in and existing in the South, the slaveholding South, but out of the sight of the slave power, right? So somewhat unsurprisingly, there aren't really very many accounts written by Maroons, right? Sources from their perspectives, which is why in my research, I focus on representations of Maroons and Maroonage in African American literature written before the Civil War. A crucial thing that still blows me away when I think about it, a historical fact to know about Maroons, is that many, many more enslaved people in this country would become Maroons or participate in acts of Maroonage in their lifetimes than would ever attempt, let alone successfully, to flee to the north or Canada via the Underground Railroad. Think of the Deep South states. Escape to the north or Canada is an impossibility, right? So we have when we look for examples of Maroonage in African American literature, and often this is in well-known texts like Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. There's a moment in Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl where when she is finally going north, the captain of the boat that she's being taken in points to a swamp where Jacobs herself had actually spent time as a Maroon, points to a swamp and says, "There is a slave territory that defies all the laws." So there is this, the importance here for me and for my research on Maroons is that African American literature presents an archive of examples of Maroonage if only we are looking for them. And that Maroonage significantly complicates our understanding of freedom and the geography of freedom in this country prior to the Civil War. I think that Maroonage is important too, to consider not just because it's a form of resistance to slavery or an opting out of slavery, but it is an affirmation of Black life, of community, of sociality, of belonging, of religion, of culture, of identity, in the face of one of the most violent and repressive systems, a system predicated on death and violence, that of chattel slavery in this country. And I also think too that there's a certain resonance, thinking of Maroonage and its complications of freedom to our current moment with migrants and refugees throughout the world, that Maroonage has something to offer to that conversation as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Good job without any visuals. You remind us that language itself is really powerful and we can see things. And the term Maroon, I always associated with Haiti. And to be reminded that that was going on here too is so important. And that there's a whole rural life, quite wild and unchanneled in this country that's so important to know about. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, our next speaker will be Renata Kobetts Miller. She will speak on the Victorian actress in the novel and on the stage.
The Victorian actress was magnetic. The Victorian actress was magnetic because performing for public audiences gave her access to a public life that was not available to most 19th century women. Novelists and playwrights were obsessed with her. They used the figure of the actress in order to define their own relationships with their audiences. As a result, they shaped the relationship between the Victorian actress and Victorian society. That is the subject of my new book, The Victorian Actress in the Novel and on the Stage, which just came out from Edinburgh University Press. I want to talk more about this book today by talking about my choice of the image for the cover. I found this image when I was doing research in the theater archives of the Victorian Albert Museum. It's housed in a large postal office building built in the 1860s. And I was doing research on an entirely different project. I was looking for images of a play that was written in 1893. And because of the way theater archives are organized, I did this by looking through a large file of images of the actress Ellen Terry, who performed in that play. While I was looking through that large file of images, I came across this one, and I immediately fell in love with it. And this is the uncropped version of what now appears on the cover of the book. And I fell in love with it because it crystallizes 5 or so themes that are really key to the book itself, which I was just finishing when I stumbled upon this. And those, to start with, we're looking at an image of Ellen Terry and her mother. The Terrys were a theatrical family. Both of these women had stage careers, and so this is a photo that depicts generations. And my book looks at the changing role of the Victorian actress over the course of the 19th century, beginning in the 1840s and ending with the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century. Ellen Terry herself is an important part of that story of the changing role of the actress, because while she participated in a profession that was viewed as being akin to prostitution, she herself gained a position of cultural prestige in the late 19th century. And she worked with the actor Henry Irving, who had the distinction of being the first actor to receive a knighthood in 1895. This appears to be an intimate moment between a mother and a daughter. It seems to be a close moment. But we also see the photographer's drape behind them, which is very similar to a stage curtain. And this emphasizes the performed nature of this moment. The fact that actresses may always be performing was a concern for Victorian writers, who tried to establish the actress's authenticity. This is particularly important in the 19th century because the 19th century was a period of increasing class fluidity, and the actress was perceived as someone who could perform her way in and out of different social roles, revealing all social class as performance. And so writers tried to establish a basis for an actress's authentic self. Very often they did this by tying the actress to a family role or a domestic setting. We're also looking at two actresses who are reading a book, and my book is about how the position of actresses was defined by what was written about them. And finally, this is a photo that was taken by Lewis Carroll in the early 1860s. Lewis Carroll is best known as the author of Alice in Wonderland, and so this really speaks to the fascination that writers had with actresses. All of this has bearing on the Me Too and Time's Up movements of today. Today, as in the Victorian period, the actress's position as a public woman renders her vulnerable to abuse, but also positions her to change the culture. This is an image of the Actresses Franchise League, which was an organization of actresses devoted to the cause of women's votes. It had a playwriting division. And so in the final chapter of my book, I turn to actresses who became playwrights in order to write new roles for women, both on the stage and in society. Thank you.
I wasn't aware of that history. That's fascinating. And to think that back then, as now, many of the writers and directors must have been men, and women started taking up the writing. It's so perfectly relevant. Sorry to use that word to what's happening today in Hollywood. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker will be Lauren Shohet, who is professor of English at Villanova University. Her talk will be about No Time Before Mediation, Listening with Eve.
We are living through an explosion of media forms. It's exhilarating, it's baffling, it's expanding the range of our literacies. It does come at a cost. As a society, we're reading fewer books, we're studying less literature. I'm interested in three things I hear us worrying about: that media absorption cuts us off from the past, that media absorption cuts us off from the real, that mediation makes us narcissistic. The pace of technological change is so rapid we can feel we're living in an entirely new world with no access to the past wisdom that might guide us. But the past worried about very similar issues. We can find familiar questions at the center of the oldest European literature that we have, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and in John Milton's 17th century recounting of the beginning of human time, Paradise Lost. Homer's epics were themselves written at a time of great media change when the Greeks invented their alphabet. And these poems think about what's gained and what's lost in different media forms: pictures, songs, oral recitation, writing. Homer, and 1,000 years later, Virgil, give us heroes who are enthralled and endangered by the excitement of seeing familiar experience in new forms. Odysseus risks death to hear his story sung back to him by the sirens. Aeneas finds great solace but is almost paralyzed by seeing the story of his homeland painted in pictures in Carthage. So to a long view of media change, we don't see unmediated past yielding to hypermediated present. I'm sorry, that was a mistake, and I can't make it go back. We'll leave that there. We don't see it yielding to an unmediated present. Instead, we see ongoing negotiations of different forms of mediation. We see dynamic ecologies where newer and older forms of mediation are dropped, picked up, relayed, recombined. The main point of my project is challenging the idea that in the 20th and 21st century, mediation replaces some earlier natural form of experience. I think that fundamentally misunderstands the human condition. There is no human experience without mediation. The word medium, the singular of media, means in the middle. Biologists call the nourishing gel in the middle of a petri dish a medium. Media hold things together. Media include our senses and how we represent what we sense and how our brains process this information into meaning. Media are elements and natural habitats. Here's where I wanted you to see this slide. Media are all the ways things get from out there to in here and back again. Milton's Paradise Lost casts the fall of humanity as the greatest media change of all time. With the withdrawal of divine presence from the world is left with footprints and traces and signs for humans to read. We don't read Paradise Lost as much as we used to, but it's still with us in the mediated forms of popular adaptations. The continued significance of Paradise Lost is important, in part because its gender politics are distressing and have been very influential. There's no question that Milton's Eve is secondary to Adam. But if we rethink the value of mediation, this might change how we think about Eve and about women. Eve's natural habitat is mediation. When created, her first action is gazing at her reflection in a lake. She learns God's plans through dreams and by listening in as Adam has face-to-face conversations with angels. Eve is mediated, so we think she's vain and foolish. If we think the world is a place where direct access is more truthful than mediation, then Adam's our man. But if mediation is essential to human experience, then Eve's focus on reflection and twice-told tales is essential. To this view, Eve might model an attentive student of new media. Newly created, exploring her image and the image of the sky in a reflecting pool, Eve knows there's no time before mediation.
I love the recovery of Eve. And it's so interesting about media. I mean, we're seeing some sort of commonalities here, but just recognizing that, we've always told stories and always sought to find meaning in things, in whatever media we have at hand, however simple our tools or sophisticated. So thank you for a wonderful presentation. And when you say Milton, I think many of us probably shudder, but you did good in reminding us it's a great work of art for big reasons. Thank you all. This was so much fun.
So so first let's have one more round of applause for all of our participants. And also let's thank the MLA for organizing this. This was an outstanding program. And please stand. So, but We're not done yet. So first of all, we need to ask our three esteemed judges to leave the room and in the hallway to please confer, and either with a puff of white smoke or by coming back in, you'll let me know that you've made a decision. Now we're going to allow you to vote, and actually one of the things I'm intrigued to find out is if you all vote the same way our judges do, because most of the people in this audience are academics. While a few people are finishing up, I just wanted to share a few thoughts that I had while listening to them. One is, I was struck by the fact that people who have heard generally of the MLA or know what the concept is of a language or literature professor would have no idea that this kind of research is going on. And again, I would return to the word relevance. People, I don't think give scholars like these credit for doing work that actually, even if it goes as far back as Dante, and actually there was a lot of great history in these presentations, is incredibly relevant to issues we're facing today. So that was one thing that occurred to me. I was also struck by the diversity of institutions and interests represented, which I think speaks well to this organization and to the state of literary and language study. I also found myself thinking, how fortunate are the students in their classrooms? Because what we saw today wasn't just learning about the research, but I could imagine myself not listening for 5 minutes, but for 50 minutes, enthralled by any of these people. And I just think that's a great thing for the profession and for higher ed. So let's applaud that. And while we're waiting, do people have questions or comments that they'd like to make? Yes.
I just want to take this opportunity, since this is the second of 2 humanities and 5 panels, and I would like to give another public acknowledgement to Ann Geer, this year's president of the Modern Language Association, for this innovation and many others within the program. So would this group please give her a round of applause?
And do other people, I'm curious, particularly if people have comments or questions about the format, because that's in some ways what we're trying to highlight here, is the ability to share this kind of information in concise, accessible ways. And I'm curious if any of you have questions or comments on that, or if any of the panelists wanted to talk about what it was like to organize in this way. Yes?
I'd like to, following up on the thank you to Anne, I'd like to say that Anne did organize a coaching session for all of us. We didn't come into this completely cold, and so that was enormously helpful to have someone working with us. Sorry, and so it was, I would say, Anne organized a coaching session a couple of nights ago for all of us. We didn't come into this without any preparation, and so it was enormously helpful to have that interaction with a more senior person speaking to us and giving us tips on how to present our work.
Yes.
I have a question about whether you've actually, you obviously have taught in this way in your classrooms, and have you seen that it's made a difference to how your students have been able to then go and access the print text, the reading, the literary text that they have to read without the aid of, you know, the contemporized visuals that you give them? Do they go back, like for example, do they go back and read Dante's Inferno and get it and enjoy the language of Dante's Inferno, or Milton's Paradise Lost, or the Underground, you know, Railway, anything that's kind of reading text in the classroom?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd be happy to respond to that. I find that our spontaneity as teachers gives students permission to give the observations that kind of pop into their heads, and because we can still talk with some specificity about the text because, you know, we've refreshed ourselves on it even though we may not be teaching from notes, that they're more motivated to participate in a conversation that sounds like the kinds of conversations, the Socratic conversations I have in my classroom, that they would have with their friends, and so it draws them into the learning process. I don't know if anyone else wants this. Oh, they start out by reading, actually. Yeah, no, I always have them, with a part of the flipped classroom, right? They have to do a little bit of writing related to the reading assignment. But their desire to talk amongst themselves and with their friends, and knowing that the point of entry is having done the reading, if it's that kind of conversation, they want to do it.
So the judges have returned, and I also have the tabulation of your vote. So do the judges have a piece of paper with their results? Oh, okay. There's clearly a lot of tension right now. And what is interesting, well, it's interesting we have some overlap and some not. I will start with the how you voted. Your top choices were in third place Professor Cowling, in second place Professor Cordell, and in first place Professor DiMaggio. So that was the voice of your group. Then we will start. No. That. It changes every time somebody edits their vote. Okay. Well, so that is why it is a good thing that we have a panel of judges, and So yes, in Chicago, they told me they were honest Chicago residents. So we're gonna assume that this is legit. And there, in number 3, the third, and actually I should say, each of these 3 winners will receive the new MLA Members Cookbook. And this prize was selected, I believe, even before anyone knew that there would be a chocolate reference.
I actually have a recipe in there.
So yeah, okay, excellent. So in third place, we have Liam Corley on the voice of veterans in American literature. So if you want to come up and get your cookbook. Thank you. In second place, we, of course, go to chocolate with Erin Cowling. And in first place, we have Manu speaking about brown poets. Now, I brought, for however many last, the Inside Higher Ed Poetry Magnet with Higher Education words, so you can all be prize winners today, and so please come up and get that since you're word people. And again, I would close just by saying how impressive this entire group is. It's gutsy in a forum like this where people may have future career goals to get up and talk in a less formally scripted way, to be judged by 3 people who are not academics, and yet I thought they did an exceptional job. So please join me in thanking them.